G'day everyone and welcome to SHOEphoria, the podcast where myths are made and broken. And this is episode 5. I hope you enjoy it. And I also hope you'll follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and of course, Facebook. I'm Simon Bartold, your host for this episode of SHOEphoria. And I have a fantastic podcast for you today. It's not very often that I get to speak to the president of a major footwear company, but that's exactly what I have in store for you today. This fellow is the president of a very large Chinese company called 361 Degrees. You may not have heard of 361 Degrees, but in fact they're a massive Chinese athletic footwear company. And my guest is the president of the company in the United States of America. It's a very interesting story how he went from a company by the name of ASICS in the USA, which has $1 billion company in the USA, to a company with a $0 balance and bringing it into the USA. I'm sure you'll be intrigued by his story. My guest today is a very old and dear friend of mine and colleague. I worked with him for many years at ASICS. His name is Mr. Jim Monahan, and he is the president of 361 Degrees in the United States of America. Jim has a fascinating and really distinguished career in the footwear industry. He started off as a tech rep with ASICS many years ago and worked his way up through the chain to eventually become vice president for footwear of ASICS America. I've had the great privilege of working with Jim over many years as a part of a wonderful team of people from all over the world to develop footwear for ASICS over some 20-odd years. Jim's going to really take us on a bit of a tour de force here today in terms of talking about his career and how it developed. It's a very, very interesting story. He's going to give us some insights into what he thought was the most interesting project he's ever worked on in his long and illustrious career. And he's going to tell us a little bit about 361 Degrees, which I'm sure you'll find fascinating, and also about some of the cultural differences that he finds working with companies in China as compared to what he was used to working with a Japanese company. And there are some significant cultural differences there. In all, I think you'll be fascinated by this episode 5 of SHOEphoria. My special guest, Mr. Jim Monahan. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy it.
You're listening to the SHOEphoria Podcast by Bartold Clinical. Listen in as we delve deep into the world of evidence-based sports science, sports medicine, and athletic footwear science. Let's go and bust some myths.
Well, hi everybody, it's Simon Bartold and welcome to SHOEphoria, the podcast that talks all things footwear. I am delighted to have with me today Mr. James Edward Monahan III, a very aristocratic name. He is Lord of Orange County, Earl of California. Well, none of that's true, but he is an absolute goldmine of information in the footwear industry. He's one of the most experienced people I know, and he has been a great friend for over 20 years. And Jim, we've had a few adventures around the world over the years.
We certainly have, Simon. It's an honor to be chatting with you again. We haven't seen each other. It's been too long. I obviously need to talk to you more because you make me feel really important.
Well, you are important, mate. As you heard from the introduction, Jim has a massive bank of experience in the footwear industry. But I wanted to start off this chat, Jim, by just rolling back the years a bit and getting a bit of an understanding of how you first started in this crazy footwear industry. What was your starting point in this game?
You know, I was really fortunate, Simon, starting out back in 1992 as a tech rep, actually, for ASICS. And I was thinking a little bit about it the other day and thinking back on that experience in 1992 and, you know, being hired by ASICS, going through 2 full weeks of immersion in the ASICS shoe school by some of the best developers that ASICS had to offer back in that day, Hase's and Kiyosawas and guys that are legends in their own right. And 2 weeks after that, being thrown in the middle of the New York City Marathon to sell shoes. So that was, a little bit of baptism by fire. And, haven't really looked back since. Been extremely fortunate to have spent many years with ASICS, predominantly on the running side. After I went in-house as, assistant category manager, head of the entire footwear team, and then eventually having an opportunity to ascend to vice president of footwear ASICS America. So very much of a blessed career. And after leaving ASICS, starting this venture with 361. So as somebody told me, it is certainly a crazy industry, but one that I'm super proud to be a part of.
For sure, yeah, and one you've achieved an enormous amount in. Those days with ASICS, they were sort of halcyon days, weren't they? I was not there I was actually in 1992, but not at an international level, more at a local Australian level, doing stuff with our dear friend Mark Doherty, who also is a legend in the industry, who I hope to interview at some point in time. Yeah. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. And Jim, it's a spread of years now, so you're talking about almost 30 years, and I think back on all of this and where we were in 1992 and where we are in 2020. And what's your impression of how it's all gone in this 30-year time frame, especially in the last 5 years? What's your overall thoughts on where we are as an industry?
I think where we sit as an industry today is phenomenal. And, we look back over the history, and I view it as a series of starts and stops for the industry. The industry leader, Nike, a lot of those starts and stops in the industry are centered around some of the innovation that they come up with. And when they are innovating, it forces the rest of the industry to innovate. You look at a brand like ASICS that was predominantly centered on running and team sports. It pushed that brand to innovate and pushed each brand to innovate in their own little microcosm, if you will. I think what has happened in the last 5 years has seen probably the most rapid change, in my opinion. And to be honest, Simon, I'd probably take it back even further than 5 years. I'd take it back maybe 8 with the onset of, some of what we refer to as the challenger brands. I think the industry owes a great amount of debt to brands like Hoka, like On, like Ultra, runners that decided, hey, I want to create my own stuff. Who knows product better than me? Who knows product better than the end user? I'm going to bring my story to market, right? And, I think they've pushed the industry, especially your more, I hate to use the word traditional players, but those players that have had longer time in the industries to stand up and take notice. And it's made all of us better. And at the end of the day, the consumers have benefited.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and one we've not talked about at all in the podcast to date. And you and I were very involved through the innovation period with ASICS, and right now you can't help but admire, or in my case, be staggered by what Nike are doing in terms of innovation. But a lot of this, I think, really did get driven by the minimalist trend, where people were actually forced to take a step back and say, look, everything's just got too complex and we don't understand the product and it needs to be simpler. And I think probably in the mid-2000s, there would have been no opportunity for companies like Hoka or Ultra or On, just to quote a few that you have mentioned. They wouldn't have got a foothold, but the consumer appetite was really there for these startups, really, and shoes that looked weird, frankly, but people gave them a chance, and look where we are now.
Absolutely. Following what I love about what we did through the years at ASICS, or even since I left, and just following the industry in general, is learning from the science, learning from individuals like yourself that really study biomechanics and the shoe-foot interface, or the entire body and shoe interface. Things like minimalism set the entire industry on its ear. And while some agreed or disagreed with it, you and I probably disagreeing more than agreeing, but I think what we can agree with is that it brought change in thought, right? And as you said, people looking at constructing shoes in a more simple way, getting away from componentry. One of the things that concerned me, being on the product side of things, was as we move towards more of this simpler construction, how is the consumer going to accept it, right? How are they going to accept buying for decades on componentry? And the more componentry you had, the more expensive a shoe was, right? And now we're paying premium dollars for pretty simple shoes. So it's interesting, how things come full circle. And I think you've talked about this before, right? The simplicity of shoemaking with some new subtle nuances.
Yeah, look, I think it's really interesting. And you have had the unfortunate experience of hearing me rabbit on for many years about motion control and yada, yada, yada. And I think my point always was that you really need the least amount of shoe required for that individual athlete to get the task done. And for some people, that's going to be a Vibram 5 Fingers, and for others, it's going to be a Brooks Beast. that's the least amount of shoe for that individual athlete. And I think what we lost sight of is that we fell into the trap of thinking that there was one true way, and that just doesn't work with the human organism. There is no one true way. Yeah, so I think it's a really good point, and I think the days where we have a shoe that has 27 different icons for 27 different technologies, I just don't think that's where people want to be these days. And I'd be interested in your thoughts. Obviously, you're a shoe builder. I mean, you are involved now in your role as president of 361 Degrees. And I might just spend a moment explaining this here because the Australian audience probably is not all that familiar with this product, Jim, because it doesn't have a great foothold here in Australia. But it is doing very well in America, and congratulations for that. I haven't been in the USA since 2019, and I was very impressed with what I saw as a real foothold in the marketplace there in America, and obviously also in Europe. But 361 Degrees is a Chinese brand that is focusing on running footwear. Is that correct, Jim, in the USA?
Yes, it's really started on a global expansion, or I say international expansion in running in 2014, with the primary markets being Europe and the US.
Yeah, so it's no small task to take on the presidency of a company like that and bring it cold into the USA or Europe. That was Jim unzipping his jacket, if you're wondering what that was. Thought I better just clarify that.
My apologies.
To actually go from 2014 to 2020 and bring a brand into America, I mean, maybe just run us through that, Jim, because I imagine that must have been quite a task.
It's been a humbling experience, Simon. You leave a brand that's $1 billion and you walk into open a door that has $0 in sales, right? So it has been humbling. It's been rewarding. It's been a phenomenal opportunity to pioneer something. We have a long way to go. We just were talking about earlier, the industry has never been more competitive. But what we have in our corner are consumers that want new things and want to try new things. And, the onus is on us as a brand to make sure that we're pushing the envelope and that we are providing sound alternatives for the consumer. We've made headway. We have a lot more to make. Our partnerships are strong here in the United States with very important retailers. We're going to continue to fight and battle up against those big guys that are out there.
It all gets back to product, doesn't it? And there's no better example than Hoka, who also started from scratch in, I believe, 2009, and they're now well over $100 million company. And it gets back to product. I remember very well when Hoka did something incredibly brave, and that is completely swam against the tide in relation to the minimalist trend that was in its absolute exploding at that time. Yeah, and they came out with what people were calling the clown shoes, and everybody mocked them. But one of the very interesting things is that without making any claims other than the shoe was very light and had huge stack heights, people were finding that they were comfortable and they were getting results in it. So it got back to product. We saw that at ASICS, that the product was always very strong. Very rarely did we see a shoe that didn't perform or do what we thought it would do. That's your strength, I guess, Jim, at 361 Degrees. If you've got the product, people will consider it.
Well, we're obviously, first and foremost, the old saying, product is king. And we've been very satisfied with the reception of the product. Again, not perfect. Show me a perfect running shoe, right? One of the things that I've always latched on to is a comment you made a long time ago, and you reiterated today, is everybody's a case study of one, right? We're never going to solve everybody's issues, but what we want to do is be able to provide a great fit, quality product, and something that, provides a great running experience. And that's what we're here to do. And it is really about that running experience. And we want to be a positive contributor, if you will, to that running experience.
You're an American who's worked for many years for a Japanese company and now is working for a Chinese company. And I'm fascinated by China in terms of what I don't know about it. So I look at brands like Li-Ning, who a lot of people probably haven't heard of, but Li-Ning is a massive company, huge turnover and really, really big company. But because the population of China is so huge, it's largely isolated there. What are your thoughts on, I guess, culturally and from a business perspective, how different is it dealing with the company like 361, a Chinese brand, than it is, say, a Japanese brand like ASICS? Is it very much different?
I'm still learning, Simon, to be quite honest with you, and it's been 6 years into this venture. I think one takeaway for me, maybe in the difference, is the aggressiveness of the mentality to pursue business. It's not that the Japanese are not aggressive. It's just obviously presented in a very different way. And I think that's probably been my biggest takeaway. I love Asia. Been spent a lot of time in Asia in my career, as you mentioned, but still learning about the Chinese culture, obviously. Embrace it every time I'm there, like I did when I was in Japan. But I just think there's a difference in the aggressiveness of the message and the mentality, I guess is the best way for me to summarize it.
Yeah, so it's a whole new way of doing business, and that comment doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I understand nothing about it at all. I've actually, apart from Hong Kong, which doesn't really count, I've never been to China, which is extraordinary given how long I've been in this industry. Yeah, so I do understand the way of doing business is quite different. I suppose that's the challenge of translating that to some degree to the USA, which has a completely different mentality. Okay, so I want to swing back to ASICS and put you on the spot and say, okay, well, you were there for a long, long time and you saw a lot of different product over many years. Is there one favorite project that you can think of that you're involved in at ASICS that comes to mind?
Wow. Great question. I wish that you had sent me that one before, Simon. I could have thought of that one.
I'd like you to be on the hop, Jim.
I'll say this. It's not one shoe that really stands out to me, Simon. It was really the collection that was put together, a consistent, excellent collection that was innovative, that addressed the science, that addressed the needs of the consumer, addressed what was right for the brand, and all the individuals that worked on that. That for me, was probably the thing that stands out the most. You know, you talk about the team I worked with was responsible for putting the brand into the neutral category. You know, when I was there, it was only a stability brand. And we sat around one day and said, well, what happens if we make neutral shoes? Nike seems to be selling a lot of those shoes that have airbags in them, right? How do we do it differently? Mm-hmm. But again, you look at breakthroughs like the Kinsei, which you were involved in. You look at the evolution of Kayanos in 2000. I mean, some legendary product there, but it's really the series of just a very strong collection from top to bottom that was put together. And that was through the efforts of a lot of people, Simon, you and Mark and the team in Japan and teams throughout the world, US and Europe as well.
Yeah, I think that pretty much echoes my own thoughts. And I didn't want to send you that because I did want you to sort of be on the hop there a bit, but we were very lucky. I mean, we got to work with Kayano-san, one of the most iconic designers of all time, and we got to work on those shoes. And it's, for all of us who were there, it's a great thrill to be walking down the street and see product, and you can think, yeah, I can actually remember parts of that. It might be interesting for people who are listening to know that the process is not always smooth, is it? I mean, we had a fantastic team. There was Jim and Yuri Elsgeist, who's now working in Europe with 361 Degrees, and Mark Doherty and Bryce Newton and a whole lot of people. And we had a bit of argy-bargy, didn't we, Jim, around the table? You know, I think when you have this challenge to build really excellent, innovative product, you do need this interaction between people who have an opinion, and you do need interaction between the designers and the developers and the innovators to get to the end point. And sometimes the process is not all paved in gold, is it?
No, not at all. And if it was, everyone would be doing it. Everything would be perfect, obviously, right? I mean, there needs to be a little bit of what I call a little bit of a combative environment, but at the same time, one that's respectful. You talk about some of those conversations we had through the years with all those individuals in large groups as the brand got bigger. And how did the day always end, Simon? The day always ended with, hey, let's go have a beer. We were all there to make great product, share our opinions. None of it was personal. And at the end of the day, we wanted to go and enjoy each other's company. And having a table of yes men is not good. And we certainly did not. And we had a lot of really, really, really good people. And at the end of the day, that's what makes a brand or a product successful.
Well, personally, I got called a lot of rude names by a lot of different people, but I always very much enjoyed that end of the day, going into Sanamiya in Kobe in search of the perfect steak and a nice cold beer. That sums it up very nicely, that combative atmosphere it's a creative process, and you just cannot have everybody agreeing, otherwise you don't get to the creation. I wanted to touch a little bit on the Kinsei that you mentioned, Jim. This was a very interesting shoe, and I think if I had to pick one, it probably was my favorite project to work on, just because it basically was quite extraordinary in that it essentially had no budget. So we got told to showcase what the technical capability of ASICS was. And I'd be really interested for you to sort of walk us through that project, because you were very involved in the Kinsei as well. And I remember us launching it actually at New York City Marathon. It was great fun.
It was just that, Simon. It was, hey, let's push the boundaries. Let's not start with a exact concept. Let's see what's possible, right? Let's look at evolving. When I say let's look at what's possible, looking at deformation, right? And taking it to the nth degree, looking at what can happen from mid-stance to forefoot, what can happen when using the best Japanese materials, right? That shoe ultimately ended up the Kinsei, but it was another one of those shoes that started out with the name of Onitsuka, right? It was the Gel Onitsuka, as did any product that started truly from an innovative lab type situation. And that Kinsei went through many, many iterations. And, I think what I've learned through the years is at some point, the multiple iterations need to stop and you just need to get it to market, right? Because getting it to market, you learn as much as you do trying to get it to a point where you can get to market, right? Get it to market and continue to evolve on that. So that was certainly probably, at the time, one of the biggest breakthroughs that the brand had. And, it became a global phenomenon and became, the number one shoe in Brazil for a long time, at the very highest possible prices that you could sell a shoe for in Brazil.
That was all down to that beautiful man, Giovanni Decker, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. There's a guy that can stir it up, huh?
Exactly. I'm fascinated by that comment about get it to market, because I had a very interesting chat with Jean-Luc, who was one of the two creators of Hoka back in the day, as actually an ex-Salomon guy. And I spoke with him at ISPO a couple of years ago, and we were talking about this, and he said, look, our philosophy at Hoka is we get it to about 60% and we put it to market, because we could mess around with it for years and years and years. And what we basically do is let the marketplace tell us what's needed. That's an interesting take on it all, isn't it?
I think he's spot on. And I often do. Spending a lot of time on a plane, you have a lot of time to think. But, if I look back on some of the things that I would have done differently, it would have been just that. Get some products to market. We lost a lot of products that never got out of the lab, quite honestly, because it was the continual pursuit of it needs to be better, we need to do this, we need to do that. Well, paralysis by analysis. Get it to market, let the end user have the final say. And I think he's spot on, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, it's like a very large-scale wear testing experiment, isn't it? But with production models. And I think that this whole concept of the 3-year bullseye, with the third year being the center of the bullseye, and it's been refined by the people at the coalface, in other words, the runners, is not a bad concept to follow. I mean, you want to have good base product, but it doesn't need to be 100% perfect. So I do think that's quite interesting. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up reasonably soon, but I just want to pick your brains on sustainable trends. And we're in a very different world now, so we are seeing much lighter, much more flexible product. We're seeing a lot of the use of geometry, so we're seeing more rounded contours than we saw a few years back. And obviously, the pendulum at the moment has swung very firmly in the direction of cushioning and maybe away from motion control to a degree. But that pendulum is notoriously fickle, and it does swing from year to year. But right now, for you, Jim Monahan, and as somebody who's in charge of a major brand, what are the big trends you're looking at now, without giving away any secrets? But what are you interested in?
You certainly have to acknowledge and pay attention to what is creating what I like to call a lot of the noise and interest, right? And as you mentioned, we're in some very interesting times, whether it be cushioning, whether it be flexibility, whether it be the introduction of carbon fiber plates, which, as you said in your conversation with Benno, not necessarily new, right? Thought process. I remember sitting around a table with you the last time we were probably in Santa Mia together, where you said, we need to take the geometry of a track spike and make it a running shoe. We need to take a track spike, 4-foot, make it a running shoe. Need to have this real high, You need to pay attention to all those things. What I think at the end of the day, Simon, we're paying attention to is having a greater understanding of how some of these trends in geometry, these trends in implementing other devices into a midsole, what do they really mean for the masses? And how much will they really be accepted by the lion's share of those individuals that are buying shoes? And trust me, I love innovation as much as anybody. But at the end of the day, you have lost leaders that create a buzz, and you have shoes that you sell, right? Brooks is still the number one brand in this industry, selling a lot of shoes that are fairly traditional. I think it's finding the blend of all the things that are happening out there today, but not getting caught up in the hoopla of the marketing of it, but understanding more what it really means for the masses. And having these conversations around even carbon fiber plates, right? How do you customize that for more of an everyday runner? You've talked about it in some of your shows that you've had. Because right now it's predominantly a racing oriented, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but a little bit more of a go fast type setup, right? How do you translate that into Jim Monahan, who's running 10-minute miles, right?
Yeah.
What does that really mean for me? I don't know if I really answered your message concretely, besides saying that we're looking at it all. But at the end of the day, we need to sell shoes. And bringing that all together to make the best possible shoe we can for the most number of people, most number of runners out there, that's our goal.
Yeah, no, I think you've answered the question perfectly. And, I love what Nike are doing, but I think they'd be the first to acknowledge that things like the Next Percent, Vaporfly Next Percent, and the Alpha Fly are not for everyone. And they shouldn't be for everybody. There's plenty of people like you and me who like to run so we can drink beer and eat pizza on the weekend. And that's the sum total goal of our running experience. And there's others who have a passion to race and win races. And I think it's an interesting question, and there's a good parallel with sports medicine. That the question I always ask myself when I see new technologies coming along, things like shockwave therapy or platelet-rich plasma or all these interventions that are the next big thing. And, I've got friends whose practices are filled with machines and, all sorts of things. And the question I always ask myself, and often of them, is, has it changed the way you practice? Has it changed the way you treat your patient? Does it make a difference? And the answer is often, well, not really, just another tool. But it's interesting in sports medicine because where we're going now is the big new treatment goal is exercise. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to have a machine. We know that for things like knee osteoarthritis, exercise is tremendously important and it makes a huge difference. So, with footwear, it's the same. When you start adding all this stuff to shoes, you really do have to ask that basic, simple question, will it make a difference? Will it work? Will it benefit the athlete?
And, I think, Simon, to your point is it may not necessarily change the way you practice medicine, but it may change the way the patient thinks about that doctor, that they're cutting edge, right? But at the root of it, it's sort of kind of his core medicine that gets him by. And I would view the footwear business the same way. And I will say that I think we as a brand need to create a little bit more of those disruptive-oriented products. And if you were to ask me what we're focusing on, that would be it, right? But at the end of the day, we're selling shoes to the everyday runner, while at the same time innovating and making sure that people understand that when you're buying a 361 shoe, you're buying not only a brand that cares about contributing to your running experience in a positive way, but a brand that's constantly, innovating and is on the forefront of shoe design.
That's also interesting. I mean, if I was president of 361 Degrees, I would definitely not be wanting to get involved in the arms race with Nike and Saucony and those guys and what they're doing. And the reason I wouldn't get involved in that is that I see there are clear gaps in the other markets that innovation and, as you say, disruption can absolutely fill. I mean, it's not all about being 4% more efficient. There are other things you can do that might revolve around protection rather than performance. There are a lot of things that can still be done.
As our good friend Mark Doherty would say, you got to identify the soft underbelly of the pig.
Yes, I can hear him saying that.
That's what we're doing, is looking for our gaps, right? Because we're not going to win an arms race. So we need to figure out where there are spots in the marketplace and capitalize on them.
And on that note, so that's a great spot to end at 32 minutes. So I said I'd keep you for half an hour. I've taken you a bit over that. But Jim Monahan, thank you very, very much, president of 361 Degrees and industry icon. I really, really appreciate you taking the time, mate. It's probably, for me, been the most interesting talk I've had so far because I guess we know each other so well and we know the history, but also because of your insight is a little bit more global or more spread than some of the more focused discussions we've had. So thank you very much for your time.
honor to be here. I really, really appreciate you having me on. And more importantly, I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
For sure. Thanks, Jim. We'll catch up very soon. Bye for now.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us for the SHOEphoria Podcast by Bartold Clinical. Join us next time.